Israel's most protected airspace just failed. And what happened 30 kilometers south of the Negev Nuclear Research Center on the night of March 21st, 2026, is not just another missile strike headline. It is a systems failure of strategic consequence, one that every defense analyst, every nuclear planner, and every intelligence community from Tel Aviv to Washington to Beijing is dissecting right now. Let me give you the numbers. 180 people injured, 64 hospitalized in Dimona alone, 116 more in Arad, 7 of them in serious condition, 3 apartment buildings in Arad at risk of collapse, a 10-year-old child with shrapnel injuries in Dimona, a 4-year-old girl in critical condition in Arad, buildings sheared open, craters carved into residential streets, and the Israeli Defense Forces issuing a statement that will reverberate through military doctrinal reviews for years. They could not intercept the missiles. That sentence, "we could not intercept the missiles," means everything in the context of what Dimona represents. The Shimon Negev Nuclear Research Center, located approximately 13 kilometers southeast of the city of Dimona, is the beating heart of Israel's nuclear deterrent. Built secretly beginning in 1958 with French technical assistance, it has never been submitted to IAEA safeguards inspections. Israel neither confirms nor denies its nuclear weapons program, a policy known in Hebrew as amimut. But the international intelligence community has long assessed that Israel possesses between 80 and 400 nuclear warheads, deliverable by land, air, and sea. Dimona is where that deterrent lives. And this week, Iran's missiles came within 20 kilometers of it. This is the first time in the 4 weeks of the U.S.-Israel war on Iran, a war that began February 28th, that Iranian missiles have penetrated Israel's layered air defense architecture in the Negev. That architecture, designed specifically to be impenetrable, consists of 3 distinct systems. Arrow 3, built jointly by Israel Aerospace Industries and Boeing, is the outermost layer. It intercepts ballistic missiles in the exo-atmosphere above 100 kilometers altitude before re-entry. David Sling, co-developed by Rafael Advanced Defense Systems and Raytheon, handles medium to long-range ballistic missiles and cruise missiles at lower altitudes. Iron Dome, the most publicly recognized system, handles short-range rockets and artillery shells. In theory, nothing with a ballistic trajectory aimed at the Negev should survive all 3 layers. On March 21st, multiple missiles got through. The question the IDF and the Pentagon are now working through is how. There are several operational hypotheses that defense analysts are considering. The first is trajectory manipulation. Advanced Iranian ballistic missiles, specifically the Fatah hypersonic glide vehicle and the Khaybar-Shakan medium-range ballistic missile, have demonstrated the ability to alter their terminal trajectories, reducing the predictable re-entry path that radar-guided interceptors depend on. If Iran used maneuvering re-entry vehicles, or MARVs, on any of these platforms, it could explain why Arrow 3 struggled to achieve a kill solution at altitude. The second hypothesis is saturation. If Iran fired a sufficient number of missiles simultaneously at Dimona and Arad, it may have temporarily overwhelmed the engagement capacity of the radar and fire control systems directing the interceptors. Arrow 3 batteries have a finite magazine, and there is a rate of fire ceiling on any interceptor system. A coordinated saturation salvo exploits exactly that ceiling. The third hypothesis, and this is the one that should concern American defense planners the most, is that Iran may have employed electronic countermeasures advanced enough to degrade the radar acquisition windows of David Sling and Arrow 3 in the critical seconds before intercept. Israel's military chief stated that Iran fired what he described as a 2-stage intercontinental ballistic missile in at least one of the attacks. If verified, this would represent a dramatic shift in Iranian launch architecture. ICBMs are not optimized for short-range theater strikes. Their trajectories are typically designed for ranges exceeding 5,500 kilometers. Adapting an ICBM for a theater strike into Israel from Iran would represent a novel tactical deployment of strategic-class hardware. It would also suggest Iran has used what military analysts call a depressed trajectory, a flat, high-speed re-entry angle that drastically reduces the time available for an interceptor to achieve a kill. Iran's parliament speaker, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, said explicitly that Israel's failure to intercept missiles in the heavily protected Dimona area signals the entry into a new operational phase of this conflict. He is not wrong. If you're following this closely and you think this kind of operational analysis matters, hit that like button right now. It tells us you want more of this depth. Let's place this into the wider operational picture. The same morning, March 21st, the U.S. struck Iran's Natanz uranium enrichment complex, the Shahid Ahmadi Roshan facility, located approximately 220 kilometers southeast of Tehran in Isfahan province. Israel denied responsibility, and the Pentagon declined to comment. But the operational pattern is consistent with GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator employment, which the U.S. used extensively during the 12-day war in June 2025 to target the underground fuel enrichment halls at Natanz and at Fordo. The IAEA confirmed that entrance structures to the underground fuel enrichment plant at Natanz sustained damage, but that no radioactive consequences were detected off-site. The FEP itself, which had already been classified as severely damaged after June 2025, showed no additional impact. Here is the intelligence picture on Iran's remaining nuclear infrastructure. According to the Institute for Science and International Security, which has been analyzing commercial satellite imagery throughout this conflict, the U.S.-Israeli campaign, beginning with Operation Rising Lion and Operation Midnight Hammer in June 2025, effectively destroyed or severely degraded Iran's centrifuge enrichment program. Before those operations, Natanz's underground halls housed more than 18,400 centrifuges. The above-ground pilot facility was Iran's primary research and development platform for centrifuge technology, including production of 60% enriched uranium. Both were massively damaged. The IAEA has assessed that approximately 440 kilograms of Iran's 60% enriched uranium stockpile is now buried under rubble at the Isfahan complex, material that, while inaccessible in its current state, represents a residual proliferation concern if Iran ever attempts recovery operations. Here's the strategic math. 60% enriched uranium is not weapons grade. Weapons grade requires 90% or greater uranium-235 enrichment. But going from 60% to 90% requires significantly less additional enrichment than going from the 3 to 5% levels used in civilian power reactors. With functional centrifuges and a decision to break out, Iran's remaining stockpile represents a viable starting point. American Central Command Admiral Brad Cooper stated this week that U.S. forces have struck 8,000 military targets across Iran since February 28th. Iran's ability to mount offensive operations against vessels in the Strait of Hormuz has been, in Cooper's words, degraded, including a strike by 5,000-pound bombs on an underground coastal storage facility housing anti-ship cruise missiles and mobile missile launchers. And yet, Iran just penetrated Israel's most protected airspace and hit within 20 kilometers of Dimona. The Strait of Hormuz remains the other critical flashpoint. President Trump issued a 48-hour ultimatum Saturday night, threatening to obliterate Iranian power plants, starting with the largest, if Tehran does not fully and unconditionally open the strait. Approximately 20% of the world's traded oil transits through the Strait of Hormuz. With the strait effectively closed to vessels belonging to countries involved in attacks against Iran, oil prices have risen considerably. The Trump administration temporarily lifted sanctions on Iranian oil already loaded on vessels before Friday, a measure the Iranian oil ministry described as essentially irrelevant, since it claims no crude oil remains in floating storage. The regional military architecture is also shifting. Iran attacked the joint UK-US base at Diego Garcia, a facility in the British Indian Ocean territory that hosts B-2 Spirit bombers and is one of the principal platforms from which long-range bombing sorties against Iran are conducted. The attack was unsuccessful. Britain's Ministry of Defense described the Iranian action as evidence of Tehran lashing out across the region. Iran also struck Saudi Arabia, which intercepted one of 3 missiles. In response, Riyadh expelled Iran's military attaché and 4 other embassy personnel. Turkey's foreign minister warned that Gulf nations may be forced to retaliate militarily. 22 countries, including France, Germany, the United Kingdom, and Japan, expressed readiness to contribute to ensuring safe maritime passage through the Strait of Hormuz. The question I want you to sit with and share your answer in the comments is this: Does Iran's ability to hit near Dimona on March 21st fundamentally change the deterrence calculus for Israel? Or does it actually accelerate an Israeli decision to escalate in ways that could cross thresholds no one is prepared for? Because here is what the intelligence and doctrine communities are now confronting. Israel's nuclear deterrent rests on the combination of amimut, the policy of deliberate opacity, and the assumption of invulnerability of its nuclear infrastructure. If adversaries can visibly penetrate the air defense architecture around Dimona, the credibility of the deterrent is not necessarily degraded in terms of capability. Israel's weapons presumably remain secure. But the psychological and doctrinal architecture around the deterrent has been exposed as less absolute than it appeared. And in the logic of nuclear deterrence, perception is as important as capability. Israel's Defense Minister Katz has announced a significant escalation of strike intensity starting this week. If that escalation includes strikes against Iranian leadership targets or remaining nuclear infrastructure beyond what has already been hit, it risks triggering an Iranian response that moves beyond ballistic missiles toward what intelligence analysts have long called Iran's dormant options, including any residual weapons-usable material, proxy operations by remaining Hezbollah assets in Lebanon, or coordination with other regional actors who might calculate that an exhausted and overextended Israel represents an opportunity. There are also two secondary dimensions of this crisis that American viewers need to understand. First, U.S. casualties in this conflict have now reached at least 13 military deaths, a figure that is generating increasing domestic political pressure. Second, the leadership uncertainty inside Iran remains acute. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Mojtaba Khamenei has not appeared in public since assuming the role. The IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, controls Iran's ballistic missile arsenals operationally. The political command chain between the new supreme leader, president, parliament, and IRGC is opaque, which means the risk of miscalculation by any node in that chain is real. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. We cover this conflict with the operational and technical depth that no mainstream outlet delivers. And share this video, because this story is not going to de-escalate on its own. And the more people understand the real mechanics at work, the better equipped we all are to process what comes next. From a purely analytical projection standpoint, and this is a projection, not a certainty, the next 72 hours are likely to determine whether this conflict reaches a new ceiling of strategic restraint or whether it crosses into territory that no party, including the United States, has fully prepared for. The 48-hour Trump ultimatum on Hormuz expires Monday evening. Israel's stated escalation plan begins this week. And Iran has now demonstrated it can reach into the heart of Israel's nuclear geography. The conditions for a miscalculation or a deliberate escalation that spirals past any red line either party had previously drawn are more present right now than at any point since February 28th.